everybody? Hopefully you're doing pretty well today. Again, this is going to be put out on Tuesday, April 7th. We're moving on from chapter 35, where we just talked about World War I, and now we're getting into Pan-Africanism. Pretty much followed right behind, right in line with it. So this will be chapter 36 that we're focusing on today. Again, hopefully everything is going pretty well for you guys. Hopefully you're staying safe. Hopefully you're washing your hands consistently and making sure no one else is going to spread this deadly virus. And hopefully you guys are staying sane with the whole quarantine going on. I'm sure plenty of you are probably playing a lot of video games. If you're a reader, you're probably getting a lot of reading in. But again, hopefully you're finding something to keep yourself from going crazy during all this. However, with that being said, we're going to get into notes today. Again, for this first couple days of notes, I'm not going to put any review questions in. I'm just kind of being nice. I'd rather you guys just focus on the vocab, then getting the notes, and then getting the success criteria done. So those are the only three things they're going to be focusing on for at least this first week, and then along with your Admentum assignment that you need to make sure that you're working on. Then you also have the full day Thursday and Friday to work on. So yeah, getting into today, the growth of Pan-Africanism. Again, this one's going to be pretty short. There's only 4 success criteria. I know the last section was also kind of short. There's only 5. Again, that's kind of by design. Try to keep things short. Try to keep things sweet. That way you guys are moving on and keep getting all your stuff done. So today's success criteria, we got a couple here. We got 4. So number 1, explain Pan-Africanism and identify who coordinated the first Pan-Africanism conference. 2, identify W.E.B. Du Bois, Dubois's role in the Pan-Africanism conferences. 3, explain Nkrumah's push for national liberation. And then 4, explain the Negritude movement and its connection to nationalism. So a couple things here to get through today. Shouldn't take us super long, shouldn't take us too much time. Again, make sure you're getting your vocab done if you haven't already got it done, and make sure you get your success criteria done once you're done watching this video. So, getting into today. So, very first slide here, the first Pan-Africanism conference. So, first off, we need to understand what Pan-Africanism is. Pretty simply, we got Pan and you got Africanism. So, Africanism is pretty simple, right? You think of African people. Good. Pan, on the other hand, is where we get a little kind of confused. So, Pan-Africanism is the belief in the global unity of people of African descent for the purpose of social, political, and economic empowerment. So, basically, this is meaning that all Africans, African Americans, you can be from Scotland, you can be from Great Britain, you can be from anywhere. If you have any sort of African in you, you fit into this. So, Pan-Africanism was really focused on the advancement of all people of African descent. So anyone, it didn't matter if you were, again, it didn't matter where you were from, it didn't matter where you were living, where you were residing. It was the empowerment of all these Africans who had been oppressed and had been kind of mistreated since they left Africa, or even since their families were in Africa. So the leader of the first conference, which lasted 3 days, was Henry Sylvester William. He was a Trinidadian lawyer in London, England. Again, so this did not originate in the United States. However, we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois before. He ends up getting pretty heavily involved later on, but Booker T. Washington is kind of involved here at the beginning. So the conference caught a lot of steam thanks to the support of Booker T. Washington. Again, we talked about Booker T. Washington. If you guys want to know any more about him, let me know. I can make a short video about him again, or you guys can simply, I guess I can put up some of the old notes. But the first meeting focused nothing on European colonialism, control of African Americans or their land. So the first conference really had nothing to do with slavery or the fact that African Americans, in most instances, were still being controlled, or their actions were still being controlled by colonial whites. That wasn't really the whole idea of the first conference. First conference was really focused on, trying to building up the unity part of, getting all parties involved from every different country possible and bringing them together initially to really have the sense of unity that people are there and be able to express the other problems that are going on there. And what you're going to end up seeing is W.E.B. Du Bois, which I'm going on to the next slide now. W.E.B. Du Bois took this tradition about 20 years later when they had the second conference and kind of shocked people with what he was saying. So nearly 20 years later, in 1919, W.E.B. Du Bois would take lead in the the second Pan-Africanism conference. However, this one did focus more on that European colonialism, with Europeans really controlling African Americans and what they're doing, and slavery and things of that nature, which obviously we knew it was an issue, especially in America. We realized this was an issue. However, what W.E.B. was saying is actually kind of shocking. He was saying, despite all the issues of racism and prejudice, that Western civilization was still the universal standard of progress for African Americans. So he's saying, despite slavery, despite prejudice and racism, because slavery is done at this point, so we're just really focused on racism and prejudice. He's saying, despite all these issues, our civilization was still kind of the standard, mainly because there were African territory, parts of Africa that were being controlled by other countries, where there were still Africans being enslaved. So he's saying, yes, we have our issues, yes, we have our problems, but we are still, the standard of progress. We are still, the ones who are the most far ahead, even though you can make the argument that France probably was by the way they treated our troops. But he's still saying African Americans are further along than what other Africans are in Africa and other parts of the world. So it's kind of shocked people. I mean, it probably shocked you too. You'd be like, well, that's not acceptable, prejudice and racism. But he's saying for the time being, they were further along than what most other places were. And he realized that it's not an easy process, and it's a long, drawn-out process. So he's saying, despite it being that bad, it's going to continue to move forward. He believed people should conform to Western society ideas, which was a very drastic change compared to what the original idea of Pan-Africanism meant in nationalism. When you think of nationalism, it's taking great pride in your country. So the idea of African nationalism is taking great pride in being African and thinking about your heritage, your history, and things of those nature. Where, as W.E.B. was kind of saying, try to put your heritage, put your old feelings on the back burner and really focus on conforming to Western society's ideas. Mainly because he was saying if African Americans were to conform, it would make life of African Americans easier instead of resisting change. It's kind of what he's saying here. Again, which was extremely unusual, as it went against the idea of self-determination, the importance of African heritage, and the freedom from colonialism expressed in the first conference. Again, colonialism kind of seems like the bad thing here. It's the idea of basically pushing away from white culture is what they're saying here. But instead, W.E.B. is saying, conform to it. Saying, not necessarily forget about your heritage, not forget about where you're from, what you've been through, but to move past it. Which I think is a pretty strong lesson to think about and learn from, even in today. I mean, because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about still applies to today. And, we talk about culture a lot in this class. We're continuing to talk about culture a lot. And we're going to talk about, that European colonialism culture versus the African American culture at the time. And we're going to be able to talk about that later on today, and how those two kind of clash together and how issues really sprout up because of it, instead of being able to kind of mingle and intermix together. Continuing tradition continues here. Other leaders at the conference would go on to lead their countries respectively, including the leader of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was a firm believer in socialism, believing that wealth should be owned by the community, not the individual. So he would not be a big fan of America, because America runs on capitalism, not socialism. He proposed support in wars of national liberation to free African American nations from European rule. Again here, pretty simple. He's a big believer in saying Africans shouldn't be underneath the control of Europeans. Plain and simple. Majority of his accomplishments were actually made without violence. Again, he was a very peaceful protest guy, so think much more along the lines of someone like Martin Luther King rather than someone like Malcolm X. However, outside of a few violent upheavals and military coups, so military coups are like where the military actually uprises and takes over the government, which in this case was Africans taking over the government. And finally here, continuing the tradition, the final thing here, the negritude movement. Again, this was a decade of what we would consider a literary explosion. So when we talk about literary, you think of writing, you think of arts, you think about things of that nature. But this was among Africans in Africa. So writers and artists throughout the 1930s and 1950s focused on literature opposing European colonialism and the assimilation of African Americans to Western culture. So assimilation basically means conforming. So basically, like, if everyone in your group says that, whoever's the best rapper, and then you agree with them, like, even though you don't think that's true, but you agree with them, you're assimilating. That means you're putting yourself into that group. So they were against assimilation because of its integration between African Americans and, not necessarily African Americans, but Africans and whites. So they really were into this intermixing idea at this point in time. They don't want to have Africans intermingling with whites and the cultures kind of clashing together. They would rather just keep them apart. These works would inspire a new round of Pan-Africanism, a form of African nationalism or nation building. So again, here you can kind of see the art on the picture here, on the screen here. This was kind of the things they were making, and it was more of a historical approach and a historic take on the things that they had originated from Africa, and when you think about African culture. So yeah, that's all we got today. Again, if you guys have questions about Pan-Africanism, feel free to reach out to me and I'll help you out as much as I can. If not, make sure you get your success criteria done. Again, all that stuff is on Google Classroom. And so yeah, make sure you get it all done. Make sure you get turned in. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you guys tomorrow on Wednesday.